I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss US President Joe Biden's momentous visit to Kyiv, look at the stories that came out of the Munich Security Conference, we deep dive into the state of the war across Ukraine's east, and we speak to a former Belarusian diplomat, Pavel Slunkin, about his experiences in 2015 at Minsk, and his thoughts on the impact of the invasion on Alexander Lukashenka and Belarus as a whole.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 20th of February, day 362. And joining me today are Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, our Defence Editor Danielle Sheridan, and our guest is Policy Analyst, Visiting Fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations and former Belarusian diplomat Pavel Slunkin. I started by asking Dom to sum up the main events of the day.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. So the big story of the day is President Joe Biden. He's just left about an hour ago, an hour and a minute ago, just left Kyiv, a lightning visit there. Surprise visit-ish. Was it a surprise? We knew he was going to Poland this week, so a quick detour was always likely. However, nothing was ever confirmed in advance. And actually, John Hudson of the Washington Post has literally just tweeted that Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, he said that the White House had told the Kremlin in advance that Biden was going to go to Kyiv. Jake Sullivan said, "We did notify the Russians that President Biden would be travelling. We did some hours before his departure for deconfliction purposes." He went on to say it's unprecedented in modern times to have a US president visit a country at war. Sorry, this is John Hudson speaking. To visit a country at war when the US military doesn't have control of the critical infrastructure and basically the safety of the whole area. Sullivan called it an inherently risky undertaking that sent an unmistakable message of US support to Ukraine. So really interesting stuff there. We'll dig into that in a minute. And the big moving part over the weekend was the Munich Security Conference, which Danielle's going to speak about. I will come back later with some battlefield updates from around the Donbass. There's been quite a lot of movement there, but I'll just let Danielle come in now.
Thanks very much, Dom. Well, Danielle, thank you so much for joining us. You were in Munich over the weekend. What did you see? What stories were you reporting on there?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. As you mentioned, I attended the Munich Security Conference, which it was just a fascinating event to attend because of this time last year, it was, whether or not Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And there was kind of this hesitation whether to call them out, whether to say Putin was going to go for it. People were still hoping that they wouldn't. I think President Zelensky even attended in person. And lo and behold, they did invade. So there was this kind of really, it just felt very poignant this year. A year on from almost to the day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was felt very acutely. The chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Christoph, I'm sorry if I pronounced his name wrong, he became very emotional at the end of his opening remarks, and was holding back tears when he introduced a musician to play a piece of music to commemorate the victims of this illegal invasion. And pretty much throughout most of the speeches that were given, they were really kind of peppered with emotion and genuine, heartfelt support from these top diplomats. Kamala Harris, when she addressed the audience on Saturday, VP of the US, she referenced Bucha twice, speaking of how the world saw these images that showed the atrocities Russia had committed. She spoke of people that had been butchered by Putin's regime, of those that had been murdered And it was just incredibly striking to see these world leaders talk about the real shock, the shock of what Putin has done, whilst also be talking about, diplomacy and politics and what we can do to bring an end to this terrible invasion.
Thanks very much for that, Danny. Can I just ask about one of your stories here? That Rishi Sunak must put Britain on a war footing and boost defence spending. This is coming from a senior Whitehall source. Tell us about that. What's the story there?
So there was a real sense among people I was speaking to in Munich that the UK is risking depleting its own resources as it continues to take from its own stock to help Ukraine and its own dwindling stock, I might add, to help Ukraine and not replenish it. So Macron, when he gives to Ukraine, it's not coming out of his own military's stockpiles. It's something separate to that. And some of the diplomats I was speaking to were saying, why aren't we responding to helping Ukraine in the way that the French are? That seems like the most sensible way. And obviously the spring budget is around the corner, and there's a real concern that Rishi Sunak is not going to increase defence spending in line with inflation. And look around European NATO nations. I mean, Poland is doubling its defence spend to 4%. Estonia, I think, has gone up to 3%. Everyone is putting themselves on this, war footing. They're recognising, as I think I quoted this diplomat in my piece, that they see what's coming downstream and it's not pleasant. And we need to be investing more in the defence of the realm, putting money into the military, ensuring that we've got the capabilities that would protect us if something worse happens in the years to come. And one of the people I was speaking to made a very kind of poignant remark about Putin now. This war is not over, and Putin is regrouping. He will be putting more money into his resources. He will be ensuring that his military gets better, and he is on a war footing. And therefore, if this dictator is on a war footing, we should all be on that footing.
And can I just ask you about one more story you've written up? This is from a remark from Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator for South Carolina, who said that Ukrainian pilots should be trained on F-16s. These are the jets from today. And I thought that was very interesting because it showed us some of the bipartisanship in the US. What was your story there?
Yeah, so Lindsey Graham gave an interview yesterday, and it was actually quite an emotionally charged interview. So he was talking about the need to train fighter pilots and saying it needs to start from now. It needs to start today. We can't be saying this is something we're going to do and then kicking it into the long grass. I mean, Rishi Sunak announced when Zelensky was in the UK last week that the UK would start training Ukrainian pilots to NATO standard levels of flying, but no date has been given. And I think that is a recurrent theme. We might promise these things, but we aren't actually giving a definitive timescale of when we're going to see it implemented. And Lindsey Graham was just pushing and saying right now is when we should be starting. And also he was quite complimentary of Kamala Harris and saying he agreed with a lot of her sentiment. And he made this comment about, what is more kind of stark than the VP talking about war crimes that have been committed by a Russian president in Germany. Like, he was saying this is a symbolic moment and we just have to act now, and we can't say we'll do it in next month, whatever. Like, it needs to start with a sense of urgency. And Zelensky has pressed this theme of urgency as well. I think the word was speed that he kept using when he gave his address, obviously by video camera to the delegates gathered. And in Brussels last week, the NATO Secretary General kept on saying we need to work with speed and urgency. So this is a really big theme now that seems to be shifting through. And I do think Sunak, to his credit, is getting there. When he spoke at the conference, he did say that they would be delivering weapons much quicker than the UK was doing so at the start of the year. He spoke of wanting to double down on this initiative. But I think one of the big takeaways from me was this sense of urgency and speed, and it really not time for people to rest on their laurels, and we just need to really go at this throw everything that we can at Putin's aggression.
Thank you very much, Danny, for that. Is there anything more from you on Munich Security Conference, or shall I go to Dom Nichols?
I mean, I just say my last point is it was really amazing to see so many people gathered and to really get a sense of how passionate people felt about the war in Ukraine. And I just hope that these aren't kind of empty words, and that, NATO nations really do continue to up their game, as it were, in its support and help for Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Danny, for joining us. It's great to hear you. Great to have you back on the podcast. And thank you very much for your reports there. Dom Nichols, can I turn to you? What are the latest updates, the military updates from Ukraine? What would you like to talk us through?
Yeah, sure. We're going to come back to Munich a bit later because there's lots more to say there. But on the front, so let's have a look. So the Russian offensive is continuing. So I think I'm not the only one here. Many other commentators have said that this much vaunted spring offensive is underway. I happen to think that's correct. I think Russia's got nothing left in the locker, really, other than personnel, and that's why we see these tactics that they're employing, been described as human wave tactics by Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary. So I don't think we should say no. This is just normal, and actually the offensive is coming when they get all the tanks out and all the rest of it. I don't think they've got any tanks left. So I think this is the offensive underway. So let's have a look at it, and bear with me for a minute, if we may. So for those that are unfamiliar with the geography of Ukraine, the Donbass, the Donetsk coal basin, the Donbass, is the big bulgy bit in the east of the country that sticks right out into Russia. Now, made up of two regions, two counties, two oblasts, if you like, two oblasts in Ukrainian terminology, the Luhansk and Donetsk oblast. Luhansk to the north, which is almost totally under Russian control, and Donetsk to the south and southwest, which is much less so. Much less of that is controlled by Russia at the moment. So going north to south, there's three main towns I want to focus on. So you've got Kreminna, which is about 75 kilometres northwest of Luhansk, the big city in Luhansk Oblast. It's about 100 k's northeast of Donetsk. It's essentially the limit that Ukraine got to in their massive charge east out of Kyiv last autumn. Now that area, Kreminna, it's been long fought over. Ukraine wants to take it because it is a town on a major logistical route, north-south running road that runs north, or comes out of Russia to the north, down into the Donbass. It's a major resupply route for Russia. Ukraine wants to take that road and take Kreminna, which is the kind of big town on the road, to absolutely sever that artery. Russia knows that, and hence has had its VDV, the Russian airborne forces, the better trained, better equipped forces there in recent months. Now, they've achieved very limited success, Russia. They were obviously trying to push west. They've got they're a little bit to the west of the town of Kreminna itself, which is an area that's heavily forested, and that just slows down all sorts of all kind of military movement. It's very, very difficult to fight in wooded areas, forestry areas. It's difficult to move vehicles through there, personnel, you can't see each other, so it's very difficult to do anything there. So that's where the line has seemingly settled at the moment in around Kreminna to the north. Now the next axis that Russia's pushing on in this offensive is Bakhmut. So let's go. So Bakhmut, we're now 50 k's about southwest of Kreminna on a direct line down between Kreminna and Donetsk city. Now, Bakhmut, a town of very limited operational significance. It really isn't on the way to anywhere. It doesn't hold anything. It's not hugely tactically important. The Wagner Group, the private military company, the mercenary group, has been smashing its head against Bakhmut for months. It has had some success to the north and the south of the town. It's not yet encircled, but it's looking as if Ukraine will cede that ground. You never want to go backwards as an army, but it has come at such cost for Russia that the thinking is that Ukraine and the defenders generally take fewer casualties than attackers. You're better dug in, you have better prepared positions. Attacking, you have to expose yourself and cover ground to go and take the enemy positions. So Russia has lost thousands of people trying to take Bakhmut, and it looks as if Ukraine are going to slowly move backwards and make them pay a very heavy price for every inch gained. And then you got the town of Vuhledar. So let's go another 50 km southwest of Donetsk city itself. So we're right down in the south of the Donbass here. And this was fought over by regular Russian forces with lots of conscripts and mobilized people going in there after those original forces were heavily depleted. The terrain outside of Vuhledar, so outside the actual urban area itself of the town, is very open, which means it's good tank country, if you like, but it means you've got very good fields of view. So as a soldier with an anti-tank guided weapon, you can see for hundreds of meters, if not kilometers. So yes, it's good for tanks to speed across, but you can see them coming. Plus, because it's good for tanks, it's been heavily mined and it's been covered by all sorts of Ukrainian units. So there's a lattice work of defence there, and Russia have been mauled around Vuhledar. The regular forces have been absolutely smashed up. And today's Defence Intelligence report says that the casualties there are high, and specifically what British Defence Intelligence call the elite 155th and 40th Naval Infantry Brigades have sustained very high losses in Vuhledar and are likely combat ineffective. So when you're combat ineffective, it means you're not necessarily going backwards, you haven't been completely deleted, but you no way are you going forward, and you need a massive resurgence of personnel, equipment, rest, etc., to be able to do anything. So overall, this offensive in the Donbass, I think, is ongoing. I don't think Russia's got much left in the locker. They've probably got some reserves. You need reserves to exploit success or to plug a sudden hole if the enemy are breaking through. So if Russia have got any reserve units and tanks and armoured personnel carriers and what have you, they would be holding some of those in reserve. I don't know if they've got them. If they have, they haven't really committed them yet, partly because, well, firstly, Ukraine haven't made a breakthrough. I don't think they're necessarily trying to right now. I think they're just trying to hold the line. But secondly, Russia haven't made a massive breakthrough that they can reinforce, as I say. So I don't think there's much of a reserve, and if there is, it's not done anything recently. And I think that this is going to be the pattern for a while now. I don't think there's going to be much change in the line unless and until Russia goes through another round of mobilization and just gets dozens, tens of thousands more troops to swamp the area, or Russia develops the ability to use combined arms warfare, tanks and infantry and all the other bits and pieces working together rather than just getting up and running at the Ukrainians. Or conversely, if Ukraine are able to ingest all the Western aid, the tanks and the air defence and artillery and all the rest of it, and they're able to make a breakthrough. So I think what's happening here is Russia are trying to push with what they've got, and all they've got is manpower, in a race to try and break that line before the summer, when the ground is better to move, because we're about to come out of the nice hard frozen ground of winter. We're going to go through a few weeks of the thick cloying mud, the Rasputitsa, when you come out of winter and the ground just turns to mush, and not a lot happens then until it hardens up again in summer. And that's when I think Ukraine will be in a much better position to do anything. But for now, I think it's not going anywhere very quickly. And just one final point on this. Michael Kaufman, who's a security analyst at the US-based think tank CNA, follow him on Twitter, really good comments on this. He is saying that what he suggests is happening is that Russia had General Surovikin in charge, and he went in with the idea of stabilizing the Russian lines, and he adopted a much more defensive strategy to buy time, to rebuild the force, and preferred to defend. He was the architect of the withdrawal from Kherson to the southwest. So he was much more thinking, come back, reconstitute, hold the line, prevent any Ukrainian offensive, and then push forward in the summer when we're better able to do so. It looks as if he lost out to General Gerasimov, And Putin was demanding success. He wants to have a success by this Friday, the anniversary of the start of this phase of the war. So Gerasimov was sent in to shake things up and to get that success. But Gerasimov is all he's had is manpower to do that. He's not been able to use all the other parts of the military that either aren't there or simply haven't been built or trained properly. So Gerasimov's pushing ahead with this very manpower intensive strategy, artillery led, and then personnel following it up to try and exploit any gaps, and has yielded some gains around Bakhmut, as I said, but really not going anywhere very fast. And what that is doing is it's exhausting what few troops they have. And Ukraine are hoping, planning. I was once told if the word hope enters your plan at any point, you haven't planned enough. So I would suggest that Ukraine are planning to hold on until they get all the Western kit and they've trained more of their own personnel and they're able to make their own advance to the east. So a long-winded way of sort of coming back to where we are, but it's been a little while since we've done a deep dive into the Donbass and a bit of geography. But yeah, I think that's where we are, and that's what's been happening over the weekend.
Thanks very much, Dom. Francis Durnley, before we come to our guest, Pavel, thank you very much for waiting on us. Francis, I imagine you have some reflections on this morning's visit of President Biden to Kyiv.
Well, thank you, David. Yes, I do. I mean, it is an extraordinary visit, and I think it is important just to underline quite how extraordinary this is. This is the first visit of a US president to Ukraine in 15 years. I was watching, just before we came on air, I was watching footage of the walkabout with President Zelensky and President Biden, and there were air raid sirens sounding throughout the city as they were strolling about. So this is exceptionally rare, as Dom was saying earlier on. You don't usually have the most powerful man in the world, the figurehead of democracy, going to somewhere where it's an active war zone. So I think it's just important to stress that this is a hugely significant moment, and one that is, of course, being cheered to the rafters by Ukrainians this morning. I thought I'd just pick out a few of the remarks by President Biden because they were, as I say, pretty extraordinary. I'm here to show our unwavering support for the nation's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. 1 year later, Kyiv stands and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. I don't think you can get a clearer articulation of what President Biden thinks is at stake in Ukraine. But I also wanted to talk as well about the significance of the date, because it is actually the anniversary, of course, of the 2014 Maidan revolution, those deadly clashes between protesters and state forces in Kyiv that culminated in the ousting of President Yanukovych and the return of the 2004 constitution. So this is a hugely symbolic day in Ukraine's battle for democracy and for sovereignty, and that is not being missed by Ukrainian interpreters of the significance of this date as well. Now, you spoke earlier on, David, about the sort of seeming bipartisanship of the Republican Party, and with regard to Biden's visit, and I think it's true that there are some positive signs from the very senior figures of the Republican Party on the F-16s, but I think it's also important to contextualise this in a way of that it's quite possible that the Republicans are actually more likely criticising Biden for not doing enough and not sending the F-16. So rather than this being sort of representative of bipartisan support, it is actually a sort of thinly veiled criticism of President Biden's actions on Ukraine. But nonetheless, it's a good problem for Ukraine to have if you have senior Republicans saying do more to the Democratic Party. But I think it is important to caveat that with continuing anxiety amongst Ukraine's supporters that the Republican Party, whilst you do have senior figures like Mitch McConnell and others cheering Ukraine to the rafters, you have others who are, of course, far more critical about this idea of a blank check support for Ukraine, not least, of course, President Trump. And if he were to become president again, then I think there is a huge anxiety about what that would mean. And of course, I'm sure that Russia are looking at this Biden visit and thinking long term and are saying, well, actually, it doesn't really matter what Biden says, because in the long term, our prospects may well be strengthened by a resurgent Republican Party and, of course, war fatigue. And obviously, what another central thrust of this visit is an attempt to undermine the argument that war fatigue is a phenomenon that we are seeing, that actually we are seeing here that Western support and Western resolve for Ukraine is strengthened, and if anything is harder now than it was when the war began. And there is indeed noticeable evidence that that is the case. Just staying on the US, though, for one other thing, I was very struck by some remarks that were leaked by Antony Blinken on Friday in a conversation that he had with some experts on foreign affairs, where he seemed to suggest that for Putin, Crimea would be a red line. And even if he didn't articulate it in this way, it was sort of suggestive that there was great hesitancy within the administration with regard to supporting Ukraine in taking back Crimea. Now, he didn't say it, as I say, explicitly like that, but there is conversations that that is how it is being interpreted. And that's leading to some anxiety. So whilst we are, of course, talking today about the broad support in the United States for Ukraine's cause, I think it's important to throw in a few caveats in there that actually could be fundamental later down the line. One last thing I wanted to talk about, though, in the question of bipartisanship, and I'll have a few updates later after our guest as well in other areas, but Danielle was talking earlier on about Rishi Sunak's vows, and he has of course spoken much about the importance of training F-16 pilots, and in this area Britain is, I think, leading really above the United States in terms of training F-16 pilots and emphasising the importance of that. But here too in Britain, the bipartisanship continues on the issue of Ukraine, and I think this is a definite bipartisanship in contrast perhaps to the more partisan nature of the debate within the United States, because Sir Keir Starmer went to Ukraine on Thursday in his visit to the first visit to Kyiv, and I was just struck by his remarks about how it's vital that if he were to become the Prime Minister here in Britain, that the support for Ukraine remained the same. And he also was very keen to underline the evidence of the atrocities. And he said has to be justice in The Hague, and there has to be proper reparation in the rebuilding of Ukraine. So quite striking there in terms of observations on this issue of war crimes. And I will come back to those later because there were some quite interesting remarks too from Vice President Kamala Harris. But I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Dom and Francis. Well, Pavel Slunkin, thank you very much for joining us. Pavel, we won't waste any time introducing you again. So can you just talk to us about your career and your life in Belarus and now Ukraine?
Sure, David. Thank you for inviting me. Well, starting talking about Belarus, maybe I will give you a bit of a broad context, just because the audience can not be enough familiar with the situation in Belarus. And about my professional career, so it matters. I was 6 years old when Lukashenko was democratically elected in Belarus, so he enjoyed popularity. And in several months, like 8 months, in 1 year, he already usurped the power and became the authoritarian leader. So he rewrote the constitution. I was never supporting him. I never liked the way he rules the country. But the more we grew up, me and my friends, the more time he has been in power. Then I joined the university and started to learn international relations because I have been always interested in them, expecting that maybe when I graduate, he will already leave. But this didn't happen. When I was 18 years old, I think I first time went on protests after the presidential elections in 2010 when he stole elections. This is not the first time in 2020 when he steals elections. He has been doing this all the time since 1994. And they were cracked down. So what we are now observing in Belarus, it already happened, maybe in a demo version, kind of a demo version in previous rounds of Belarusian history. And my friends, my colleagues, the other students, they either were being arrested or they left the country, just understanding that there is no good perspective there. And the sanctions were not imposed. The hard sanctions were not imposed on Lukashenko. So Belarus was kept like, okay, we can do something with this, so let's just ignore it. And in 2012, in 2013, Lukashenko has been trying to reproach again with the European Union because he didn't like the increasing dependence on Russia. And when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea, he tried to turn back to the West, expecting to grow his political influence in the country and not to allow Russia to do the same thing with Belarus like it did with Ukrainian territory and with Crimea. So he limited repression and he started to be extremely interested in the dialogue with the West. And I saw it as a positive scenario, as a positive development for the country that has been losing all the time its time for the better foreign policy, for the better internal policies. Lukashenko released political prisoners, and he started a kind of a pro-liberal reforms in economy and in foreign policy and internal policy, just because he understood that the West won't cooperate with him if he continues repressing the people. And this time I was invited to the foreign ministry again, and I agreed, just because I think that it would be a great idea if I can fight the regime on streets, if we can beat it from there. So why not trying to make a move to give it a right move away from Moscow, and maybe expecting that the time will come and we will be having a better chance to change the country towards the democratic rule. And the changes that I've been talking about, they have been happening since 2014 till 2020. The Belarus picture of the society has changed a lot. We had a lot of NGOs independent from the country. The independent media, they not only followed the propaganda or try to fight the propaganda stories, they have been forming the mood of the society. So the society in the 7 years has transformed much and became pretty strong, one independent one, and wanted to promote changes more and more. And when election 2020 happened, Lukashenko saw it. All those millions of people that you saw on streets of Belarusian cities is the result of this kind of liberal times, when people were not beaten for going on streets, when they were not arrested for criticizing the government publicly. There were even some political analysts that could go on Belarusian TV and say things that were critical to the government. But in 2020, Lukashenko saw how dangerous it is for him. So he cracked down the protest. And we, again, first time since 2015, we got political prisoners. And this was the red line for me. I mean, I was hoping to have a better Belarus, better future for my country, but I promised myself when I joined the MFA that I would never cross my principles. And in 2020, they wanted me to do so. So I just said no. I didn't want even to resign. I was staying inside the MFA and supporting people that were protesting on streets. I was ignoring the demands, the orders that they were given to me, and I was criticizing the government from inside the foreign ministry. And in 1 month, they fired me, obviously. And in several months, I had to flee my country just because of the risk of my arrest. And since October 2020, I have been with ECFR, with the European Council on Foreign Relations, covering mostly the topics of Belarusian foreign and internal policies.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Pavel. There's a lot to get into there. Can you take us back to 2015? You were at the negotiations between Putin, Poroshenko, Hollande, Merkel and Lukashenko. Can you tell us about those days? And you were working with the Ukrainian delegation there. To talk us through what you saw.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising. We received the information that the Normandy summit will happen in Minsk 45 hours before the delegations were expected to come to Minsk. So this was extremely surprising. And yes, I worked with the Ukrainian delegation. We had those 2 days to prepare the visit organizationally and with all this diplomatic protocol stuff. And nobody knew anything. I mean, we were doing this for the first time, and it was the same surprise not only for Belarus, but for my colleagues in Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. So nobody knew what would be happening and how should it look like. But then, yeah, we were not sleeping those 2 days. And finally, this day came. We welcomed the delegation inside in Belarus, inside this Palace of Independence. And this was pretty interesting story. I already felt from inside that this is something big is already happening. I mentioned it in my Twitter thread that Putin, as usually, he came late. So the delegations of France, Germany, Ukraine, they were waiting him in the room, and I already count that the negotiations already started even before Putin arrived. Then he arrived, and then decided the leaders, they decided not to go to the room where they were expected to hold negotiations. They just stayed in the room where they were expected just to drink coffee and have a short talk. But they liked the room and they stayed there, and it took them several hours. So they crushed the program of the meeting just from the beginning. They were expected to go for the picture, shooting a protocol picture, and they never came. And only they came only in 3 or 4 hours maybe to do so. And I mentioned it in my thread that the funny story happened with Hollande, who. This is my subjective, my personal feelings. When I analyzed what he was doing there, I really saw that he was kind of feeling that he doesn't know what he was doing there. He was just following Angela Merkel and never being allowed or active, never initiated any kind of a discussion. So he just followed Angela Merkel's and her instructions. And when they came out of this room where the negotiations started, Lukashenko suggested to have a lunch as it was planned to the program, and Hollande said that that's a good idea, let's go. And Angela Merkel said no, we have to work. And they stayed working. They continued working there. The negotiations lasted 17 hours. And I think that we analyzed then if there were kind of this negotiations somewhere in Europe since World War II, and I didn't find any. So they were the longest ones, perhaps, in the modern European history. There were so many journalists and people there in the delegations that didn't expect that the negotiations would take that long. So the people were just sleeping on the floor just because there were not enough chairs there inside the palace. Nobody expected that we would need to stay there for the whole night. And finally, when it was already, I don't know, 12 a.m. or even 2 p.m. The next day, they talked to the media and said that they signed the Minsk agreement. So finally they had it, and that they need to receive an approval from those separatist guys who have been having their own negotiations in a separate place, also in Minsk, where Kuchma, the former president of Ukraine, was represented unofficially Ukraine, and he talked to those guys, separatist guys of this eastern parts of Ukraine. And so even when Merkel, Hollande, Putin, and Poroshenko agreed on Minsk agreement, Putin made them wait until all the separatist guys approve the agreement that they have been working on through all this night. And they received an approval in around 1 hour, maybe. And then finally it was done. They gave a press conference and then they left. I remember how exhausted Poroshenko was. I talked to my colleagues from the Ukrainian delegation. They were saying that he had no sleep the night before the talks. And then the talks, he was negotiating all night. And when the negotiations ended, Hollande and Merkel, they traveled to Brussels to participate in EU summit on the level of head of states. So this was the hard times for him, because Debaltseva, one of the Ukrainian cities, it was heavily attacked those days, and he was in a constant communication with his generals in Ukraine. And this was, again, part of Putin's manipulative tactics. He was heavily attacking the city just to blackmail Poroshenko and Merkel and Hollande, making them for given concessions. And the one thing that I also mentioned in my Twitter thread is that Putin was the only guy that had a special room with a bed inside the palace. So he sometimes left the room and enjoyed 15, 20, 30 minutes of sleep. So he was tired, and then he came back fresh. While Hollande, Poroshenko, and Merkel didn't have this chance. Their rooms, their places where the state were far from the palace, so they couldn't just leave the negotiations for half an hour and then come back. This is a brief overview of that night. I don't know if you have any questions, please feel free to.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that later, but thank you very much for taking us sort of inside the room to 2015. It feels like a lot has changed since then. Could we zoom out a little bit? I wanted to get your perspective on Belarus's involvement or its non-involvement in the invasion so far. Could you give us an insight into Lukashenko's thinking right now and just describe your feelings about what Belarus has done in the past year?
Yeah, this all has started in 2020 when Lukashenko lost elections, and this neutral or balanced foreign policy, it ended when then sanctions were imposed on him, when he stole elections, and the only pillar, or I would say his only foreign ally that he has, is Putin. So Putin saved him in 2020, and of course Lukashenko understands this, that his political survival depends very much on whether Putin likes him or not. So he had cut off all his contacts with the West, almost all of them. He brought back, totalitarian repression in the country. We have thousands of political prisoners in the country. And the dependence of Lukashenko's regime on Moscow has only been increasing since 2020. I think that this is part of the reason why he took a different stance on Russia's invasion. In 2014, as I told you before, he took a pretty neutral stance when he didn't recognize the annexation of Crimea. He supported the territorial integrity of Ukraine because he felt safe and secure in Belarus. He knew that he can deal with the political stability with his own political services, and he was pretty popular, legitimate for the Belarusian people those days. While now in 2022, when Russia invaded, he already couldn't, I think that he couldn't refuse to participate in it. And that's why his role is completely different from the one he played 9 years ago. I also sometimes read this narrative from Western intelligence services, from Western media, and even sometimes from Ukrainian media and Ukrainian intelligence services, that Moscow is pushing Lukashenko to send his army to Ukraine, which is absolutely misleading. I don't think that this is something that is really happening. When we analyze the relations between Lukashenko and Russia, I see only a huge support that is coming from Putin to Lukashenko. So when we analyze economic relations, we see that Russia helps Lukashenko to bypass all the economic sanctions, and they are the toughest economic sanctions that were imposed on Lukashenko's regime since its existence. And Russia helps. It provides the whole infrastructure from railway to seaports to bypass those sanctions, which lets Lukashenko to keep his billions of dollars coming into the budget of the country. He also, Russia, Putin, they also keep the lowest price for the Belarusian economy on natural gas and oil. So Lukashenko keeps enjoying the special conditions of economic cooperation with Russia. If we would think of Putin pressuring Lukashenko, we would obviously see at least some indicator that would show it. And now all the indicators are showing that they are both happy with the participation and with the role of Belarus and Lukashenko's regime in this war in Ukraine. Because since the beginning, since the invasion, Lukashenko provided Russia with everything it needed, with all military and civil infrastructure, from railway to airfields where Russian troops are stationed. The mobilized guys, they come to Belarus and they are trained there. They are treated in Belarusian hospitals. Russian military, they shell Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian infrastructure from the territory of Belarus. And if I imagine what would happen if Belarus would send his army to Ukraine, I think that they would lose everything. The safe place from where Putin can attack, can have this shortest route to try again to capture Kyiv, to pose under threat all these military, civilian facilities that are extremely important for Putin. Because even the factories, they work for Russian invasion. The facilities, I mean, the industry of Belarusian industry, it works for Russian invasion. They send ammunition, they send tanks, they send BMPs to Russia, which is then sent to Ukraine. And while the Belarusian army, it is unprofessional one. So only 15% of it is professional. So it means that only 10 to 15,000 soldiers, professional soldiers that know how to do war, can be sent to Ukraine, which obviously wouldn't break the status quo. They won't bring a decisive moment to the war, while this move will give a lot of the risk for their whole campaign. So I think that this is their joint decision of Putin, of Lukashenko, of their role that Lukashenko now plays for the invasion. They don't think that participation of Belarusian army in Ukraine is needed now. But if and when or if this happens, when Putin really would need to Belarusian army to invade, to be sent to Ukraine, I'm pretty sure that Putin has that many, I call them loyalty enforcement instruments, to make Lukashenko do it, that he would not be able to say no.
Well, thank you, Pavel, for that. That was a fascinating read of what's happening at the moment. Can I ask you just two questions quickly? Could you sum up? I mean, you've touched on it a little bit, but how has the war impacted on Belarus politically, economically, societally? And furthermore, as far as you know, what's the position of the Belarusian public? What's public opinion in regards to the war here?
So let's start with the public opinion. This is a very important issue. Lukashenko lost elections in 2020. He received almost or around 25, maybe 35%. We don't know the exact numbers, as you can imagine, just because the elections, they were falsified. While Tikhanovsky won the elections, he received around 55 to 65% in the elections if the votes would have been counted. And the mood of the society hasn't changed that much. Of course, it is under a huge totalitarian repression. But people still don't want. They don't feel Lukashenko has the right a legitimate right, a legal right to represent them. So they don't support him like actively. But there is, of course, a part of the society that supports him just because they don't see any other perspective. That they say just because, okay, we can't do anything with him, so let's just stay with what we have. And they are pretty happy that Lukashenko hasn't sent yet his army to Ukraine. They see that Lukashenko is saving them from this perspective. Like if Lukashenko would be not present in the country, then we would be attacked by Russia, like Ukraine is now. Or if he would be too close with Russia, then the Belarusian army would be there. And we have a pretty strong consensus inside the country that shows that Belarusians don't want their army to be to fight in Ukraine, no matter in which side. They just don't want to participate, and it is around from 90 to 95% of the people. This doesn't mean that, I mean, those 90% are automatically pro-Ukrainian. This is not true. I think that we have around 30-40% of the population that are more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian, while 25-35% of the people who are more pro-Ukrainian. And since that, we still have to keep in mind that it is extremely, extremely difficult to understand the mood of the society when people who comment on Facebook or say in kitchen or say to their friends or to say, I don't know, publicly somewhere that they support Ukraine, they got arrested. We have been having so many cases of the people who say that I stay with Ukraine, and they are now in prison, charged with 6 years in prison. So this means that when they are called by phone or asked to answer the question in opinion polls in the internet, they just ignore it. They don't participate. So this is a challenging issue to tell you what Belarusian society really thinks. I can only guess a bit. So I try to. And the second issue, would you please remind me what you asked?
I would say just a broad summary in your view of the last year's impact
on the
Belarus.
consequences, right? Yeah, on the consequences. So Belarus, and as a state, it has been losing its sovereignty. The more Lukashenko becomes involved in the war, the more sanctions are imposed against him, the more dependent Belarus as a society, as a country, and his regime become dependent on Russia. If previously the foreign trade of Belarus was like 35% in the EU, around 40% to Russia, and around 30% that came to other states. Now we have around 70% of Belarusian export that comes to Russia. Belarusian export is cornered. It can't reach their markets in Brazil, in India, without using the Russian territory. If previously they were sending the potash fertilizers, which brings billions of dollars yearly to the Belarusian budget, if earlier it came through the territory of Latvia or Lithuania or Poland or Ukraine, now it is all blocked because of sanctions. So Lukashenko has to export it through the Russian territory, which obviously gives Russia more and more influence over him, over more and more control over the Belarusian economy. And this is not only about economy. It keeps being the same, developing in the same direction politically, in the propaganda, in the information sphere. Lukashenko labeled extremists and even terrorists all the independent media, so they had to flee the country, and they work from exile, while inside the country the Russian propaganda is becoming stronger and stronger, just because people are cut off the independent and trustworthy information. People who follow independent media, like Belarusian independent outlets in the internet, or even just reading Telegram channels that say what is happening in reality, not propaganda stories, even for following them, people are arrested. So they are, of course, afraid. So they go to internal immigration, and they prefer not to believe to anyone. While propaganda is, of course, increasing and building more and more leverage over the Belarusian society, and this is a very dangerous scenario. And I don't see any positive scenario right now without Russia being beaten in Ukraine and without Ukraine's victory there.
Pavel, very quickly, a question from me. What would happen to you if you went back to Belarus tomorrow?
I think that I would be somewhere in jail, maybe, for 15, 20 years, tortured there, like it is happening with all our other political prisoners. They have been tortured every day, and the number of political prisoners is growing. So it is now around 1,500, and I think that it will become growing. And we know maybe half of the real political prisoners, the number, because the rest. They just don't. They prefer not to say it because of being afraid of even more pressure from the special services.
Pavel, hi, Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. Quickie, if I may, Minsk, could Poroshenko have negotiated a better deal, or was just absolutely backed into a corner and he took whatever he could? And you describe Putin turning up late, not refusing to move out of his coffee room, all that kind of stuff. I mean, do these amateur dramatics actually work, or rather, does Putin not realise that we just think that it looks a bit silly doing all this stuff, and he just comes across as a bit juvenile? Why does he do that? Thanks.
Yeah, starting with the first question about Poroshenko, I think the problem with Ukraine was not about Ukraine or only Russia. Of course, Ukraine was trying to defend itself, but the main problem, the biggest problem was that this stance of the European and Western partners, which didn't see what has been happening, what was happening those days as an invasion. They thought that Ukraine is quite a maybe special issue, that Russia didn't send their own army, that they just helped the separatists to take over the territories of Ukraine. So nobody thought about the war as a Russian invasion over Ukraine. There were a lot of in desire. Nobody wanted to see it this way. That's why Ukraine lacked the support from the Western society, macroeconomic support of supplies of weapons, etc., etc. The same thing we are observing now, like Biden in Kyiv, leopards that are sent by Germany to Ukraine, and so on and so forth, should have already happened in 2014, when Russia already invaded Ukraine, when it annexed the territory, and it has been occupying more and more territories through their proxies in eastern Ukraine. So this was his problem. Not only Russian invasion, not only Russia heavily attacking the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian territory, but the kind of ignorance or undesire of the partners, of allies to look at the reality, at the new normality. And that's why 9 years later they had to. Talking about Putin, I think that our rationality, what you, me, David, and other people here, what we understand about what is rational for us would highly likely depend very much for the guy like Putin, who is a KGB officer, who has been in power for so many years, and who still believes these lies that are brought him by his generals and FSB about American control, even that he has been hiding in bunker from the COVID. I think that it hints us about what kind of a person he is. So I think that he sees the situation a bit differently than we see it. We see that Russia is not successful enough now in the front, and is like pretty obvious for everyone. But I think that Putin can be seen in a different way. Like he is expecting that the fatigue of support for Ukraine will come. That Russian economy, it has dealing with sanctions pretty efficiently, so it's not collapsing, and then that they have a lot of human and industry resources, military resources, that if they start increasing right now, then in 1, 2, 3 years they will just in this war of attrition, they will at least achieve some of the results. I think that this explains this attitude towards the war. He is okay. He already understood that he can't capture Kyiv and Ukraine very fast, but he still thinks that he can achieve at least some of the goals, maybe in the longer term.
Thank you very much for your insights, Pavel. This is Francis speaking now. I just wanted to pick up on something you were saying there about this idea of Western mistakes. And I just wonder, when you were talking earlier about how there was this period of relative liberalisation in Belarus, what mistakes do you think the West made? Or perhaps a different way of thinking about it, what could the West have done more of in order to keep it more in the Western orbit than the Russian one?
Yeah, this is a very important issue, and I should be frank. I don't have a good answer here. I told you in my first intervention that the West has tried different approaches, sanctions. It has tried to engage in cooperation with the regime, and I think that what we have been having since 2014, since annexation of Crimea till 2020. It brought a lot of the result. So it changed the mood of the society. It changed the society. The Belarusian business grew up. The NGOs, the people dependent on, independent from the government, the number increased significantly. We have been having an IT sphere that was a rich one, and it supported people who were who received the violence from the government during the protests. So this solidarity that we saw in Belarus in 2020 is an exact and direct result of this participation, of this engagement of Belarus into the EU and Western policies. But in 2020, could the EU and the West just ignore what Lukashenko was doing? Obviously not. I mean, you can't ignore political prisoners. You can't ignore the tortures in prison. You can't ignore the cracking down of the civil society. So I don't see any kind of a alternative, just because the West, the EU, the USA, it has never had that many instruments and then that much of a leverage like Russia had. So Russia has always been leading there. And this is not mostly about mistakes of the West, but because of how deep and how strong is and was even those days the control from Moscow. So I think that the failure was kind of maybe pre-programmed. But yeah, if in 2020 we imagine that Lukashenko or his alternative candidates, if we imagine that they just don't come to participate in elections, and we would have the same elections as in 2015, which were extremely calm for him, extremely safe for him, then maybe this participation of Belarus in the invasion would never happen. But this is, again, this is nothing the West should be blamed for. This is Lukashenko actions for which he receives all those sanctions from the West right now.
Thank you. Just one final question, if I may, which is going back to Minsk. You were talking earlier about all of the machinations that took place. And I just wondered how you think history will judge the Minsk Accords. Of course, there's already been analysis that people are saying that it was, from the Ukrainians' perspective, an attempt to buy time in order to arm for what they felt would be an inevitable invasion of the rest of the territory. And from Putin's perspective, it was an attempt to solidify his grip on territories illegally seized. So I just wondered what your perspective on how history will look back on that pretty critical diplomatic phase.
Yeah, it very much depends on what the result of the invasion of Russia's invasion will be. If try to measure it right now, I think that both are true. Ukraine, yes, it received this time to be better prepared for the invasion. But at the same time, Russia prepared the invasion too. I mean, it has been preparing for the war against Ukraine too all these years, while not being sanctioned by the West, while the West has been buying the oil and natural gas from Russia and doing business as usual. Did Ukraine become, and the Ukrainian army become stronger? Obviously, yes. But should it receive all this support that it receives now, right after the Russia invaded Crimea? Yes, obviously, but it never happened. So when we say about Minsk agreements, I think that we should think of them like the text that we have there, the content that they signed this night in Minsk was maybe inevitable, just because the West was not ready to look at the reality and the new normality and to see it as an invasion to Ukraine and to give all the support it can give to Ukraine, while Ukraine, yes, had been defending itself, and it was under a bigger threat, much bigger threat maybe than now. If Russia would invade it and did the same what it did in February 2024, so the time was bought. But those 9 years, they were, I would say, lost. I mean, that the West could have supported Ukraine much more. And maybe this would help us even to avoid the invasion.
Well, thank you, Dom, Francis, for your questions. And thank you so much, Pavel, for joining us. I just want to ask each of you very quickly for your very final thoughts. What will you be looking at and thinking about, or would want the listeners to know and understand in the days ahead? Dom or Francis, who would like to go first?
I'll just jump in there very quickly. I recommend people look at the Financial Times today. Really interesting article about the Munich Security Conference and how it was received from what's termed the Global South, the term that's coming into greater currency, so African, South American, South Asian, other areas around the world. Leaders there frustrated that the security conference seemed to be dominated by Ukraine, or rather the Ukraine is dominating the West's attention and money, and that there's a perceived loyalty test the West is now applying about Ukraine. There are various leaders from, the article cites leaders from Brazil, Colombia and Namibia, all saying things like, we can't keep talking only of the war. We don't want to go on discussing who will be the winner or loser of a war. And people we're resolving the problem, not shifting the blame, so on and so forth. So people saying, look, there's other things here. There's climate change. There's all sorts of other bits and pieces. Don't force us to only talk about Ukraine. Don't force us to pick sides. And if that's the only conversation you've got coming to me, then don't be surprised if I'm less interested in talking to you than perhaps talking to Russia. So today's FT, very good piece. I recommend people have a look.
Thank you, Dom, and thank you, Francis. Pavel, as our guest, would you like the very final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I will be, of course, waiting for what Putin is going to tell us for the anniversary of the invasion. He will be having his speech in 2 days, if I'm not mistaken, or is planned to tomorrow. So I just want to see and to analyze what they have been thinking and what they are planning for the future. We have been seeing their from the observers that are saying that Russia has already started a new wave of attacking Ukrainian positions in the east. Yes, so I think that this is the place where we should put our eye on, and the relations with Russia and Belarus relations. Lukashenko was in Moscow 2 days ago, and they never commented anything since that day. That's why I obviously receive a lot of requests from media asking whether Lukashenko will invade or not, and I'm repeating them the same things that I have been saying to you right now. But yeah, I think that they will potentially they will maybe announce a bit of a more cooperation in military sphere. Lukashenko already said that he wants to build Su-25 aircrafts for Russia. This is something very important. And the other thing, the third thing is sanctions. The EU sanctions package that will be and is expected to be imposed on Russia. And there is no consensus, from what I know from my insiders in Brussels, that there is no consensus on Belarus. So this is another important issue for me.
Here at The Telegraph, we have a number of other podcasts you may be interested in, one of which is Offscript, a series of no-holds-barred, long-form interviews with world-leading commentators. Stephen Edgington joins me now to talk about a recent relevant episode. Stephen, who did you talk to?
I talked to Colonel Richard Kemp, who served in the armed forces, British Armed Forces, from 1977 until 2006, and we discussed, almost a year on from the war in Ukraine starting, what happened in the war so far, and what could potentially happen next. So we talked about the upcoming offensive, the Russian offensive, and Richard Kemp was very downbeat on this. He thinks the Ukrainians could suffer huge losses. And we talked more generally about Ukrainian tactics and Russian tactics.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. Where can listeners find the full episode of that?
On any podcast app, their favourite podcast app, or on YouTube, on the Telegraph's YouTube page.
And it's called Offscript.
Offscript, yes. So it's long-form interviews, about an hour long for each one. And we talk to people from various different backgrounds, whether they're historians, philosophers, politicians, military people, on all different subjects.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.